There is a word that appears on almost every serious map of Asia produced between 1550 and 1800. It stretches across the continent like a shadow. It covers territory we now call a dozen different countries. It describes, depending on which map you consult, nomadic horsemen, city-dwelling scholars, forest hunters, Buddhist monks, and Muslim merchants, all under the same label, all folded into the same geographic fiction. The word is Tartary. I started noticing it the way you notice a crack in a wall, first once, then everywhere. I was looking at historical maps for reasons that had nothing to do with the word itself, tracking how cartographers handled the problem of Central Asia over time, watching the blank interiors slowly acquire names and borders and topographic detail. And there it was, on map after map: Grand Tartary, Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. I assumed at first that it referred to something coherent, a civilization maybe, a language group, some recognizable cultural block that European scholars had identified and named. It does not. That is the beginning of everything strange about it. Pull out a map by Joan Bleu, published in Amsterdam in 1662, one of the finest cartographic productions of the 17th century, engraved with extraordinary precision with careful notation in the margins. Tartary on that map covers roughly 12 million square kilometers. It runs from the Volga River in the west to the Pacific coastline in the east, from the Siberian Arctic in the north to the foothills of the Himalayas in the south. The peoples living within that space spoke, conservatively, 30 distinct languages from at least 5 unrelated language families. The Mongols in the central steppe spoke Mongolic languages. The Kazakhs and Uzbeks and Kyrgyz to the west spoke Turkic languages, related to each other, but not to Mongolic, the way Spanish is related to Italian, but neither is related to Finnish. The Manchus in the far northeast spoke Tungusic languages, a completely separate family. The Tibetans in the south spoke Sino-Tibetan tongues. And scattered through the Siberian forests were dozens of smaller groups speaking languages that don't fit neatly into any major family at all. Yeniseian languages, Yukagir, Chukotko, Kamchatkan, ancient tongues that had been in those forests for thousands of years before anyone drew a map. All of them, Tartary. Now here is what I want you to sit with for a moment, because it's easy to hear this and file it away as a simple error, as ignorant European cartographers doing what ignorant people do. But that explanation doesn't hold. The information existed. The accounts were in European libraries. The Franciscan friar Giovanni da Pian del Carpine traveled to the Mongol court in 1245 and came back with detailed observations about the different peoples he had encountered along the route. William of Rubruck made the same journey 8 years later and wrote even more careful notes, describing Nestorian Christians in the steppe, Buddhist monks further east, Muslim traders in the cities, distinguishing them from each other with the eye of an attentive traveler. Marco Polo's accounts, whatever their embellishments, made clear that the peoples of the Asian interior were not a single homogeneous mass. By the 1600s, Jesuit missionaries were living in Beijing, learning Mandarin and Manchu, writing back to Rome with nuanced descriptions of Qing dynasty administration. Russian Cossack expeditions were moving through Siberia, encountering new peoples every few hundred miles, recording their names in administrative documents that eventually made it into archives. The knowledge was there, scattered, imperfect, but present. So the question isn't why Europeans didn't know. The question is why, knowing what they knew, they kept writing the same word. The word itself is the first clue. Tartary derives from Tatar, the name of a specific Turkic-speaking people who lived in the northeastern steppe region, who were partly absorbed into the Mongol Empire in the 13th century and partly dispersed westward, eventually forming communities across Russia and Central Asia that persist today. When the Mongol armies swept into Europe in the 1240s, Devastating Poland and Hungary and riding to within striking distance of Vienna, the people of Europe encountered these armies and called them Tatars. But there was a second layer to the word almost immediately. Medieval European scholars, reaching for an explanation equal to the terror, connected the sound, Tatar, to Tartarus, the name for the Greek underworld, the abyss below Hades. These were the people from the underworld, the people from the end of the known world, the people from outside. Tartars became Tartary, and the geography of fear became a geography on a map. This matters. It means the word was never simply descriptive. From its very first use in European writing, Tartary carried an image, distant, threatening, alien, beyond the boundary of the civilized. It was a word about the edge of knowing. And once a word carries that kind of freight, it becomes extremely difficult to replace with something more precise, because precision would require admitting that the edge wasn't really an edge, that what lay beyond it was comprehensible and various and human in ways the original word was designed to obscure. By the 16th century, European cartographers had subdivided the label without abandoning it. Muscovite Tartary covered the parts of the region falling under Russian expansion, Siberia, essentially, the enormous belt of forest and tundra stretching east from the Urals. Chinese Tartary labeled what the Qing dynasty administered in the northeast and what lay beyond it. Independent Tartary sat between them, covering roughly the territory of modern Kazakhstan and the neighboring steppe republics. The subdivisions acknowledge complexity without solving it. They say, we know this is not all the same, but we don't know what it actually is, or we don't know how to say what it actually is on a map. And so we are subdividing the old word rather than replacing it. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting. The peoples living within Tartary had their own robust geographic and political vocabularies. The Kazakhs understood themselves as divided into three zhus, great confederations, the elder, the middle, and the lesser, each with its own territory, its own aristocratic lineages, its own relationship to neighboring powers. This was not a vague arrangement. It was a sophisticated political structure with clear membership rules, known boundaries, and recognized leadership hierarchies. The Mongols organized themselves into distinct khanates with specific names, specific capitals where capitals existed, specific tributary relationships. The Uzbeks had city-states, Bukhara, Samarkand, Khiva, with literate bureaucracies, legal traditions drawing on Islamic jurisprudence, architectural traditions producing buildings of extraordinary beauty that were standing when Columbus crossed the Atlantic and are still standing now. None of this appears in Tartary. The word swallows it. It makes the Kazakh Zhuz system invisible, makes Bukhara's scholars invisible, makes the centuries of Mongolic and Turkic literary tradition invisible, and in their place offers a single image of undifferentiated nomadic steppe, populated by horsemen who exist outside of time and complexity. This is a specific kind of erasure, not violent erasure, not the deliberate destruction of records, something quieter, and in some ways more durable. The erasure that happens when you simply never find a word precise enough to see something clearly. The linguistic evidence makes the point forcefully. By the time European scholars in the 19th century began seriously studying the languages of Central Asia, and they did with remarkable thoroughness, driven partly by imperial competition and partly by genuine intellectual fascination, they discovered that the region was one of the most linguistically dense on Earth, not just in terms of the number of languages, but in terms of their age and diversity. The Turkic language family, which includes languages from Turkey to Western China, had been diversifying for at least 1,500 years, possibly much longer, leaving behind a spread of related tongues that philologists could use to reconstruct ancient migrations and cultural contacts. The Mongolic languages carried within their structure evidence of early contact with Turkic, with Tungusic, with Tibetan. Each borrowed word a small fossil of a historical encounter. The ancient Sogdian language, the lingua franca of the Silk Road in the early medieval period, spoken by the merchants who connected China to Rome, had left traces in dozens of later languages, a ghost tongue visible in loanwords scattered across the steppe. The languages were, in other words, archives. They contained history the way tree rings contain weather. And for centuries, European mapmakers covered all of it with a single word that meant, at its root, nothing more than, "Here be the people we are afraid of." Now consider what this meant in practice for the people actually living there. Consider a Kazakh Khan in the mid-1700s, navigating the collapse of his confederacy under Dzungar pressure from the east and Russian encroachment from the west. In Russian diplomatic correspondence, he appeared as a Tatar prince, ruler of part of Tartary, slotted into a category that made him administratively legible to Moscow as a subordinate figure in a loosely defined frontier zone. The specificity of his actual position, his lineage within the Kazakh aristocracy, his relationships with the other Zhuz leaders, the particular legal traditions governing his authority, none of this translated through the Tartary frame. The word flattened him into something manageable, something that could be categorized and filed. Russian expansion into the steppe in the 18th and 19th centuries provides one of the clearest examples of how the Tartary fiction gave way. When imperial administration required real knowledge, as Russian forts extended south and east, as the khanates were progressively absorbed, Russian ethnographers and administrators began producing detailed studies of the peoples they were governing. Suddenly there were precise records, the number of yurts in a given area, the genealogical structures of local aristocracies, the specific legal customs governing marriage and inheritance and property disputes. The blankness that Tartary represented on paper was replaced by an accumulation of administrative detail. And what that detail revealed, consistently, was that the European map label had been describing not a people, but an absence of European attention. By 1850, serious geographic works had largely retired. The term, the Royal Geographical Society in London, publishing surveys based on actual expedition data, used specific ethnic and regional names. German scholars working on the new science of comparative philology were constructing detailed family trees of the Turkic and Mongolic languages, placing each variety precisely in relation to its relatives. The Russian Imperial geographic surveys were mapping the steppe with the same precision being applied to European terrain. Tartary was dissolving, not because the peoples it had labeled changed, but because the knowledge finally caught up with the reality. What replaced it, though, and this is the part that tends to get quietly skipped, was not neutral. The 19th century replacement of Tartary with specific ethnic labels coincided exactly with the period of most aggressive Russian and British imperial expansion into Central Asia. The Great Game, that Victorian competition for influence over the region's khanates and mountain passes, produced extraordinary geographic knowledge and used it as a tool of domination. Knowing that the Kazakhs were divided into 3 Zhuz allowed Russian administrators to manipulate those divisions. Knowing the specific languages spoken by mountain communities along the Afghan frontier allowed British intelligence officers to move more effectively through those communities. The precise map was an imperial instrument. And then the Soviet period came and redrew everything again. Soviet nationality policy in the 1920s and 1930s created formal ethnic categories for the peoples of Central Asia, assigned them to specific national territories, and built administrative structures around those assignments. The Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic, the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, the Kyrgyz, Tajik, Turkmen republics. The borders were partly based on existing patterns, on where Uzbek-speaking populations were concentrated, on where Kazakh herding grounds had traditionally extended, and partly on political calculations designed to prevent any single group from dominating a large enough territory to constitute a real threat to Moscow. The modern nations that emerged from Soviet collapse in 1991 inherited those borders and are still living inside them, navigating the gap between the ethnic and linguistic realities on the ground and the political categories drawn on maps 70 years ago. There is a continuous thread here from the 1500s to the present. It runs through the Tartary fiction, through 19th century Imperial ethnography, through Soviet nationality engineering, through the modern states of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, and their ongoing negotiations with their own internal diversity. The thread is this: the peoples of Central Asia have consistently been categorized by outside powers in ways that serve those powers' administrative and political needs, and the linguistic and cultural reality, the actual complexity of what people spoke, how they organized themselves, what they understood themselves to be, has consistently been simplified or ignored or reconstructed to fit whatever the map required. I keep returning to a particular detail from William of Rubruck's account of his journey to the Mongol court in 1253. He describes arriving at a camp and discovering, to his surprise, a community of Nestorian Christians, people who had maintained a Christian tradition in the steppe for centuries, speaking their own liturgical language, conducting their own religious practices, entirely outside the European Church's awareness. He was astonished. The steppe he had imagined as uniformly pagan turned out to contain this pocket of a tradition his own civilization claimed exclusive ownership of. The encounter forced a small recalibration of his mental map, but it didn't change the word. The word traveled on regardless. Tartary absorbed the Nestorian Christians, along with everyone else, filed them away under the same label, and moved forward. What I find myself thinking about, long after closing the old atlases, is how much that word cost, not in dramatic, measurable ways, not in the way that a military conquest costs lives or a famine costs lives, but in the quieter currency of understanding, in the accumulated weight of all the encounters that never quite happened because one side was looking through a category instead of at a person. The Kazakh Khan who became, in a Russian dispatch, a Tatar prince. The Bukharan scholar whose library was described, in a European account, as surprising. Evidence of civilization in Tartary, as if civilization required surprise to be noticed. The steppe trader whose specific language nobody wrote down because all of it was, after all, just Tartar. The blankness on old maps looks like an absence of information, but the word written across that blankness was its own kind of blankness, a confident printed, beautifully engraved blankness that traveled from atlas to atlas for 300 years. We retired the word eventually. We filled in the space. And if you look at a modern map, you see the specific names: Almaty, Bishkek, Samarkand, Ulaanbaatar, cities with histories stretching back centuries, populations speaking languages with literary traditions older than many European nations, universities and archives and debates about identity and sovereignty and language rights that are as complex as anything happening anywhere else on Earth. The cartographers finally ran out of room to be vague. The word had nowhere left to hide. But I still wonder sometimes what we are writing across the blank spaces on our own maps. What confident label we are placing over something we haven't quite chosen to look at clearly. The old cartographers weren't uniquely careless or uniquely afraid. They used the tools they had, drew the boundaries their imagination supplied, and wrote the simplest word available for everything that exceeded their understanding. That impulse did not disappear when Tartary did. It only found new territory to name.